Before the big mills with their turning wheels, there was the simple hand quern. This was the most basic way to make flour, and for thousands of years it was the only way for most people. Imagine two round, flat stones, one sitting on top of the other. The bottom stone, called the bedstone, stayed still. The top stone, the runner stone, had a hole in the center and a wooden handle sticking out from its side or top. The process was straightforward but tiring. A person, usually a woman, would kneel or sit beside the quern. She would pour a handful of grain into the central hole. Then she would grab the handle and begin to turn the top stone. The stone was heavy. It took a lot of effort to get it moving and keep it going. As the runner stone turned, it ground against the bedstone. The grain was caught between them. The two stones crushed and sheared the kernels, breaking them down. The resulting meal, a coarse flour, worked its way out from between the edges of the stones. It would collect on a cloth or a hide placed underneath. This was a daily task. It was part of the rhythm of the household, like fetching water or tending the fire. The sound of the stones grinding was a common sound in any settlement. It was a slow process. Grinding enough flour for a family's daily bread could take hours. The flour wasn't fine and white like we know today. It was often gritty. Tiny bits of the stone would chip off and get mixed in with the meal. This was a serious problem. Over a lifetime, eating this gritty bread would wear down a person's teeth. Skeletons from this period often show teeth worn flat, right down to the gums. It was a sign of a life spent eating stone-ground flour from a hand quern. The hand quern gave families control over their own food. You grew the grain, you harvested it, and you ground it yourself. There was a direct connection to what you ate. It was a personal and domestic scale of production. But it was also a form of drudgery. The work was repetitive and physically demanding. It tied up a significant amount of a person's time and energy every single day. This system worked for small communities and individual households, but as populations grew and villages turned into towns, the demand for flour increased. The hand quern couldn't keep up. Society needed a more efficient way to process grain. It needed a way to produce more flour with less human labor. This need for a better method set the stage for a technological revolution. It was a change that would move the grinding process out of the home and into a dedicated building run by a specialist. It would replace the power of human arms with the power of nature, and it would change the social fabric of the medieval world just as much as it changed the way bread was made. The age of the mill was about to begin. The hand quern's days as the primary tool were numbered, though it would never disappear completely, especially among the poor or those in remote areas. But the future of flour was bigger, louder, and powered by something much stronger than a person's muscles. The first great leap in milling technology was the watermill. It was a machine that harnessed the relentless power of a river or stream to do the work that once took hours of human labor. The concept was simple, but the engineering was clever. A watermill used the flow of water to turn a large wheel. This wheel was connected to a series of gears and shafts that transferred the motion indoors, ultimately turning the heavy runner stone. There were a few main types of water wheels, and the one a miller used depended on the landscape. The most basic was the undershot wheel. This wheel sat in a fast-moving stream, and the water pushed against paddles on the bottom of the wheel, causing it to turn. It was simple to build, but not very efficient. It needed a lot of fast-moving water to generate decent power. A more advanced and powerful design was the overshot wheel. For this, the miller needed to control the water. A channel, called a mill race, would be dug to divert water from the river to a point above the mill wheel. The water then flowed into buckets built into the wheel's circumference. The sheer weight of the water in the buckets, pulled down by gravity, turned the wheel. This was much more efficient than the undershot design. It could generate significant power even with a relatively small amount of water. It just needed a drop in elevation. This often required building a dam to create a mill pond, which acted as a reservoir, ensuring a steady supply of water. The miller could control the flow using a sluice gate, opening it to start the mill and closing it to stop. Inside the mill, the magic of the machine was in its gears. The large water wheel turned a horizontal axle that went through the wall of the mill house. At the end of this axle was a large gear wheel, often called the pit wheel. This wheel's teeth meshed with the teeth of a smaller vertical gear called a lantern pinion. This ingenious arrangement did something crucial. It converted the horizontal rotation of the water wheel into the vertical rotation needed to turn the millstone. It also increased the speed. The large wheel turned slowly but with great force. By meshing with a smaller gear, it made that smaller gear spin much faster. This smaller gear was attached to a vertical spindle that went up through the floor and through the center of the stationary bedstone. The runner stone was fixed to the top of the spindle, and so the steady push of the river outside was transformed into the fast, powerful spinning of the runner stone inside. The miller would pour grain into a large funnel called a hopper, which was suspended above the stones. A small, vibrating trough would shake the grain from the hopper, feeding it at a steady rate into the hole in the center of the runner stone. The noise inside a working watermill was immense. It was a constant rumble of grinding stone, the creak of wooden gears, and the roar of the water outside. The air was thick, with fine flour dust that coated every surface. The miller had to be a master of this machine. He had to know by sound and feel if it was running correctly. He had to manage the water flow, adjust the feed of the grain, and, most importantly, control the tiny gap between the two millstones. A lever system allowed him to raise or lower the runner stone by a fraction of an inch. A wider gap produced a coarse meal for animal feed. A smaller gap produced finer flour for bread. Getting it just right was a true skill. The watermill changed everything. It could grind in an hour what a person with a hand quern could grind in a day or more. This freed up enormous amounts of labor, particularly women's labor. It allowed communities to support larger populations. But it also shifted power. Mills were expensive to build and maintain. They were typically owned by the local lord or a monastery. The peasants were often required by law to bring their grain to the lord's mill and pay a portion of their flour as a fee. The watermill was not just a machine, it was an economic engine and an instrument of social control. Not every village was blessed with a fast-flowing river. In flat landscapes, coastal regions, or places with sluggish streams, the watermill was not an option. But these places often had another powerful, invisible force, the wind. And so another kind of mill was born, the windmill. It was a different kind of machine, reaching up into the sky to catch its power, but its purpose was the same: to turn the heavy stones that made flour. The earliest and most common type of windmill in medieval Europe was the post mill. This was a wonderfully clever, if somewhat precarious, piece of engineering. The entire body of the mill, a small wooden house containing all the machinery and the millstones, was balanced on top of a single, massive central post. This post was usually the trunk of a huge oak tree, sunk deep into the ground and supported by a structure of cross timbers. This design had a crucial feature. The entire mill house could be turned to face the wind. Sticking out from the back of the mill, opposite the sails, was a long wooden beam called a tail pole. This pole reached all the way to the ground. When the wind changed direction, the miller had to physically push this tail pole, walking in a circle and rotating the entire building on its central post until the sails were once again catching the wind squarely. Well, it was heavy, demanding work. Sometimes a wheel was attached to the bottom of the tail pole to make it a little easier. The sails themselves were the engine of the windmill. There were usually 4 of them, built as large wooden frames. The miller would stretch canvas cloths over these frames. The amount of cloth used could be adjusted depending on the strength of the wind. In a light breeze, he might use the full cloth. In a strong gale, he might only use a narrow strip, or none at all, to keep the sails from spinning too fast and damaging the machinery. This was another one of the miller's essential skills, reading the weather and managing his mill's power source. Inside the post mill, the machinery was a variation on the watermill's theme. The sails turned a large axle called a windshaft, which pointed slightly downwards as it entered the mill house. On this windshaft was a huge gear wheel, the brake wheel. A large wooden or iron band could be tightened around this wheel to act as a brake, stopping the entire mechanism. The brake wheel's teeth meshed with a smaller gear, the lantern pinion, which turned a vertical shaft connected to the runner stone below. Just like in the watermill, this system converted the rotation of the sails into the spinning of the stone and increased the speed. The layout was just more compact, all packed into a small, swaying wooden box perched on a post. Over time, a more advanced design appeared: the tower mill. This was a big improvement. The main body of the mill was a fixed tower, usually built of stone or brick. It was much more stable and could be built taller than a post mill. The only part that needed to turn was the very top of the mill, a movable cap that held the sails and the windshaft. This cap rested on a set of rollers or a greased track and could be turned to face the wind. At first, this was done with a long pole or a system of chains from the ground. Later, a brilliant invention called the fantail was added. This was a small windmill mounted at a right angle to the main sails at the back of the cap. If the wind shifted and started blowing on the side of the main sails, it would also catch the fantail, which would then turn a set of gears that automatically rotated the cap until the mainsails were facing the wind again. The windmill, like its water-powered cousin, was a center of village life. Its turning sails were a landmark, visible for miles. The miller was a figure of great importance, a master of a complex and sometimes dangerous machine. He had to be a carpenter, a mechanic, and a meteorologist all in one. Life in a windmill was noisy, dusty, and constantly in motion. The entire building would shake and creak as the sails spun in a strong wind. It was a testament to human ingenuity, a way of taking the unseen energy of the air and turning it into the most basic necessity of life bread. The power of water or wind was impressive, but it was all for nothing without the very heart of the mill, the stones. The millstones were where the real work happened. They were the components that actually transformed hard and edible grain into life-sustaining flour. Everything else, the wheel, the sails, the gears, the shafts, was just a complicated system for making one stone turn upon another. A set of millstones consisted of two large, thick discs of stone. The bottom stone was called the bedstone. It was fixed in place and did not move. The top stone was the runner stone. It was the one that spun, powered by the mill's machinery. It had a hole in the center, called the eye, through which the grain was fed. The runner stone was incredibly heavy, often weighing more than a ton. But it wasn't just sitting directly on the bedstone, it was balanced with incredible precision on top of the spindle so that there was a tiny uniform gap between the two stones. The type of stone used was extremely important. A soft stone would wear down quickly and leave too much grit in the flour. The best millstones were made from a type of quartz called French burrstone. This stone came from a specific region near Paris. It was incredibly hard and had a porous cellular texture, almost like a natural grinding surface. The problem was that it didn't come in large pieces, so French burrstones were typically assembled like a jigsaw puzzle. Wedge-shaped pieces were carefully cut and fitted together, then cemented and bound with iron bands to form a single solid disc. These stones were highly prized and very expensive. They were a major investment for any miller. In other regions, millers had to make do with local rock, like granite, or a hard sandstone. But the raw stone itself wasn't enough. The true art of the miller was in a process called dressing the stones. This was the careful carving of a complex pattern of grooves into the grinding faces of both stones. The pattern was a mirror image on each stone. It consisted of deep channels called furrows, and the flat surfaces between them called lands. This pattern was not random, it was designed to do two jobs at once. First, the furrows acted like a pair of scissors. As the runner stone turned, its furrows crossed the furrows of the bedstone, cutting the grain kernels open. Second, the pattern served to move the ground meal from the center of the stones to the outside edge. The grain entered at the eye, was cracked and broken by the furrows near the center, and then was gradually ground finer and finer as it was pushed outward across the lands. By the time it reached the edge of the stones, it was flour. It was then flung out into a wooden casing that surrounded the stones, where it settled and could be collected. This pattern of furrows and lands would wear down with use. Every few weeks or months, the miller had to stop the mill and perform the difficult and skilled task of redressing the stones. This meant lifting the massive runner stone off the spindle, usually with a wooden crane built into the mill. He would then turn it over to expose its grinding face. Using a special set of hardened steel picks and hammers called mill bills, the miller would painstakingly recarve every single furrow, deepening the grooves and flattening the lands. It was slow, precise work. It was also dangerous. Chipping away at the hard stone could send sharp splinters flying. And the fine stone dust created was harmful to breathe, often leading to a lung disease called silicosis. The miller's control over his stones was absolute. He could adjust the gap between them with a mechanism of levers and screws. This adjustment, called tentering, was crucial. For coarse ground meal, he would raise the runner stone slightly. For the finest white flour, he would lower it until the stones were almost touching. He learned to make these adjustments by the sound and feel of the mill. He could tell by the rumble of the stones if they were grinding properly or if they were running empty and starting to scrape against each other, which could create sparks and cause a fire in the dusty mill. The millstones were the miller's domain. They required his strength to move them, his skill to dress them, and his constant attention to control them. They were the soul of his machine. The miller was one of the most important people in any medieval village. His mill was a vital piece of infrastructure. Without it, the community could not easily turn its harvest into food. The miller wasn't a farmer. He was a technician, a specialist with a unique and complex set of skills. He had to be a bit of an engineer to keep the machinery running, a carpenter to repair the wooden gears and wheels, a stone mason to dress the stones, and a businessman to manage his customers. The constant operation of the mill for the flow of water, the direction of the wind, the quality of the grain, the fineness of the flour, all rested on his shoulders. But despite his importance, the miller often had a terrible reputation. He was a deeply distrusted figure in medieval society. This suspicion comes up again and again in songs, stories, and official records of the time. The most famous example is Geoffrey Chaucer's miller in the Canterbury Tales, a brawny, cheating brute who was a master at stealing grain. This stereotype wasn't just a literary invention, it reflected a real and widespread anxiety. The source of this distrust was a system of payment. The miller didn't usually get paid in coin. Instead, he took a portion of the grain he ground. This payment was called the multure, or toll. The amount was often set by law or by the lord of the manor, perhaps 1/16 or 1/20 of the total. But for the peasant bringing his precious sack of grain to the mill, there was always a nagging fear. How could he be sure the miller was taking only his fair share? The whole process seemed to happen behind closed doors, amidst the noise and dust of the machinery. Peasants accused millers of all sorts of tricks. A common saying was that a miller had a thumb of gold, meaning he made his fortune by pressing his thumb on the scale when he weighed the grain or the flour, tipping the balance in his own favor. They were accused of having bags hidden away to siphon off a little extra flour here and there. Some were said to use two different sets of measures, a large one for taking their toll and a smaller one for returning the customer's flour. There was a belief that the best grain somehow got lost in the process, replaced by lower quality meal. Whether these accusations were always true is hard to say. Some millers were surely dishonest. But the system itself was built on a foundation of suspicion. The peasant was completely dependent on the miller's honesty, and that made him uneasy. This situation was made worse by the fact that most peasants didn't have a choice of where to go. Most mills were soak mills, which meant they were owned by the lord of the manor. The lord had a legal monopoly on milling in his territory. All his tenants were required by law to bring their grain to his mill and his mill only. They couldn't build their own, and in many places they were even forbidden from using a hand quern at home. Lords would send their agents to smash any illegal querns they found. This monopoly meant the peasant was a captive customer. He had to pay the lord's price and deal with the lord's miller whether he trusted him or not. The toll he paid was another form of tax, another way the lord extracted wealth from his labor. This naturally created resentment, and the miller, as the face of the system, bore the brunt of it. And yet the mill was more than just a place of work and suspicion. It was also a social hub. It was often located on the edge of the village, a place where people from the surrounding area would gather. While waiting for their grain to be ground, people would talk. They exchanged news, gossip, and stories. It was a point of connection in a world where travel was limited. The miller, for all the distrust he inspired, was at the center of this flow of information. He knew everyone and heard everything. The mill was a loud, dusty, and industrious place, a symbol of both technological progress and social tension. It was the place where the community's harvest was transformed, and in that transformation, the complex relationships of the medieval world between peasant and lord, customer, and craftsman, trust and suspicion were played out every single day.